Chattanooga is a city rich in cultural and historic landscapes. Its scenic waterways and mountains provide dramatic backdrops to these resources, available to its residents and visitors alike. Some of these legacies, so central to its dynamic urban environment, might have been lost were it not for the intervention of concerned private citizens. Here at the south end of the much-used and loved Walnut Street Bridge, saved and restored in the late 1980s based on the intervention of concerned preservationists to block its demolition, rest the remains of Chattanooga's historic Bluff Furnace, built by Ironmaster Robert Cravens prior to the Civil War as the South's first Bessemer furnace. The Bluff Furnace site has been appropriately preserved and interpreted, yet challenges still remain. Let's follow Robert Cravens to his home on the bench of Lookout Mountain, just below its imposing Palisades, which became the focus of Union forces on the first day of their breakout from the besieged city in November of 1863. As the Union troops clamber through Lookout's treacherous terrain, sweeping through the Confederate forces before them, they come upon their main objective, the home Robert Cravens had built above the growing town of Chattanooga, where he had built his innovative furnace on the bustling riverfront. Confederate forces had commandeered his home as an important position in the siege of the city, and the battle above the clouds, as it has come to be known, raged back and forth across the Cravens farm as first the Federal troops and then the Southerners held sway, only to retire from the field well after midnight. The creation of the Chickamauga and Chattanooga National Military Park in 1890 did not include this bench of the mountain, nor Cravens' house, which was finally added to the park only when a local private citizen and publisher, Adolph Ox of New York Times fame, interceded and acquired the Cravens property for the park so that its historic landscape was preserved. By this time, the Cravens family, who returned shortly after the battle to a decimated home, had rebuilt and subdivided their homestead. Several homes had been built on the battlefield, most of which remain today. Over the years, Cravens Terrace, as the subdivision came to be known, had become something of an artist colony, home to writers and artists, a tradition that is maintained to this day. Unfortunately, until quite recently, one of these historic homes, designed by architect David Stroop and known as Gray Rocks, lay abandoned for several years by an out-of-town bank who had allowed the home to fall into rack and ruin through regrettable neglect. Again, through the intervention of a local preservationist, the Loder Williams house, a significant element in the Cravens Terrace landscape, has been stabilized and an authentic restoration is underway.
So when my friend and local architect Garnet Chapin reached out to me for help in researching the history of Gray Rocks, we were able to track down a fascinating book entitled Cravens Terrace Colony by noted historian and journalist John Wilson. In the book were details about the Loder Williams family who built Gray Rocks and lived in it for nearly 100 years. From this history and details about Gray Rocks, Garnet has been able to create a solid plan for restoration of the house that preserves and protects the cultural landscape it represents.
And now to another important element of the Cravens Terrace cultural landscape that currently remains under significant threat. The Hardy residence, designed by noted local architect Clarence T. Jones, has been given to the National Park Service for potential reuse as a ranger residence with visitor facilities. But the Park Service has current plans to remove and replace it with a relocated parking lot from in front of the Cravens house, citing lack of funds for rehabilitation and reuse. The home, deemed eligible for the National Register, cannot be demolished with federal funds without the consequential Section 106 public review. Yet the National Park Service, one of the premier conservation organizations in the world, has chosen to let this historically significant house be destroyed by benign neglect. So challenges remain to this day in protecting cultural landscapes that enrich our lives and our community. Perhaps it's time again for an intervention on the part of private citizens to help protect and preserve our fragile cultural and historic landscapes.